Hey guys, welcome to today's poorly lit and weirdly filmed episode of Ancient Medicine, wherein we will be discussing regimen. That is diet, exercise, preventive measures, and what those kind of interventions look like in ancient medicine. In the background, you can hear my tiny son making noise. Hello, tiny son. Look out, let me get him. He'll say hi. Oh my gosh, that is the cat food. What are you doing in the cat food? Here's Jimmy, and that is Tethys the cat. Say hello to the ancient medicine students. Okay, I am going to stop this so I can wash the cat food off of the baby. So sorry. We'll resume at the next slide. All right, we're back. Yes, Jimmy is very excited to talk to you about Mediterranean food culture. So before we talk about diet options and medical diets in the ancient world, we've got to talk about what kinds of foods were available, what people were eating generally, and how that breaks down by socioeconomic status. So without further ado, let's start with bread. Bread is a go-to staple in the ancient Mediterranean, not just bread loaves themselves, but also grain porridges, roasted grain dishes. Barley dissolves in water and forms this nice thickening agent. More about that coming up. But bread, qua bread, is one of the major things you'd be eating in the ancient world. Now, leavening is expensive, but not that expensive. You could expect to regularly eat nice fluffy bread, but flatbreads are a standard too. You'd be eating a lot of that. Stuff a little bit like pita and naan, so that sort of texture. If you lived in an urban area, you wouldn't be doing your own baking. Rather, you'd be getting your flour baked at a local baker's, and that's where you get your leavened fluffy bread. Now, bakeries regularly made their money not by selling raw materials, but they'd taken people's grain that had already been ground and processed, and then they would make that into loaves that you could eat. Oh my goodness, you are so distracting. You are not helping. You are not helping. Okay. Here you go. Take your sippy cup. Try not to make noise. Thank you. Let's see. Grain, food, bread. Yes. We have some actual preserved bread from antiquity because carbonized loaves were created in the eruption of Vesuvius. And these looked a lot like, really? 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 Oh, honey. Oh, honey. This slide is too long to be recording with him, but we gotta do it, so let's go. Working from home. Right. These loaves look a lot like pizza slices. They're scored with a rope before they're baked, and they're these round-looking loaves that are made for tearing and then dipping into stews. And most of your meals are going to look like a stew that you're dipping your bread into, or hummusy type preparations. Beans are also a staple of most ancient diets. More about that in a bit. Now, we used to think that meat wasn't a regular part of ancient diets because growing meat is a labor and resource intensive project, and you can't produce enough with your herds unless you have some kind of a factory farming scenario, which is how we can eat so much meat. It's a result of how we grow it, for better or for worse. Now, the that we're finding on the ground from archaeological records inclusive of ancient poop. So something we've been able to do more and more of in recent years is to dig into old latrines, study the human feces, and figure out what the humans were eating. And one of the big surprises from that is that in urban centers, at least, folks are eating a lot of meat. Both seafood, land food, you name it, they're eating it. The least expensive kind of meat you could get was pork. Pigs eat just about anything. They don't require a whole lot of upkeep. Ancient cities probably had pigs free-ranging through the streets or kept in pens near urban farm kind of areas, but also gardens, courtyards, and just on the street. In rural areas, similarly, your pig would just wander around the forest all year, and then at the fall season, you'd butcher the meat and then preserve it with a combination of smoke and salt. Romans loved their prepared smoked salt spiced meats. In fact, they still do. It's the reason why a lot of our preserved meats still have Italian names to them, like salami and pepperoni and prosciutto. These are very ancient methods for preserving your pork and keeping it shelf stable without refrigeration. Pork was also a major thing offered up at the sacrifices. So part of the religious culture of the ancient world involved the ritualized slaughter of animals and then the preparation or the selling of the meat. This was because the gods didn't want the meat. They wanted to smell the fat cooking, they wanted to smell the burning thigh bones, but the meat, that part of the sacrifice was for mortals to share. You weren't sacrificing just because the gods want dead animals. You were sacrificing in order to create a feast that you and your deities would share. A little bit like a church barbecue, only with more on-site slaughter. Now, animals had to fit certain standards to be eligible for sacrifice, and this meant that your most safe source of meat, especially in urban environments, but even in rural areas too, was meat from the sacrifices. Animals had to be without blemish, they couldn't be sick, they couldn't have parasitic infestations, and they were often very young animals. Now, this led to a conflict in early Christianity for those of you who are followers of early Christian history, uh, or if you've read 1st and 2nd Corinthians. 1st Corinthians especially starts off with Paul having to weigh in on the issue of, okay, is it okay to eat sacrificed meat? Like, are we supporting idol worship by eating meat that has been sacrificed to pagan gods? This was a real conundrum for early Christians because to refuse to buy meat from these sources would be to cut yourself off from the most reliable source of safe food in the ancient city. Um, if you're interested in how that debate rolled out, then read 1st Corinthians and get one early Christian's response to this ethical dilemma. Um, Opinions seem to have varied, and a lot of Christians just wouldn't go there. So if you're not eating at the temples, where are you going to get your meat? There are butchering districts in every ancient city and even little municipalities. You're going to be able to get your meat in town mostly, but if you know a farmer, you can have direct agreements with farmers. Now, a huge movement as we get into the first centuries BC and CE in the ancient world was towards a kind of early version of factory farming. That is, independent small farmers were being replaced by large wealthy landowners who were then running their farms using enslaved human labor. This meant that large numbers of animals were being raised together on these massive farms and the meat being driven to market into cities. Now, generally, the meat would come into cities on the hoof. Before refrigeration, you couldn't really butcher it at the farm and send it in and not die. This meant, though, that meat markets in the ancient world are wet markets, and the sanitation situation isn't that great. Now, There are certain advantages to doing it this way. Your meat's going to be very, very fresh. You can pick out an animal that's healthy and you can verify that it's healthy. We see the beginning of ethical animal handling and less traumatic methods for killing animals to eat them. More about how ancient people dealt with the ethical end of this in a minute. So, the things you're eating. Well, things, they're people, just animal people. The species you're eating. Pigs. Pigs are a go-to because pigs are easy to raise. If you're okay with eating them, they're also pretty darn delicious. And the meat preserves well, you get a good return on investment. And pigs also have a large number of offspring, so it's easy to breed a lot of young pigs very quickly. They raise to a size that makes harvesting them sensible and doable. But what this meant is that if you don't eat pork in the ancient world, which a lot of folks in the ancient world didn't for both religious and ethical reasons. The primary one of this is Judaism. There were a lot of Jewish people living in the ancient world, and massive Jewish populations in every large urban center. Outside of Judea, the largest population of urban Jewish folks in the ancient world was in Alexandria, Egypt. After that, Rome. Rome had a massive Jewish population with a very high number of converts. This is something that's very different about ancient Judaism from modern Judaism, is that this was a period during which people were actively being encouraged to convert, and a lot of folks did. Pre-70 CE, relations between Jewish folks and Roman folks were also firm and relatively friendly, especially compared to Greek speakers in the Eastern Mediterranean. That relationship was pretty broken. For details, see Hanukkah. For those of you who don't know, Hanukkah is a celebration of an incident during the Jewish War of Independence from the Seleucid Empire under Antiochus IV. It wasn't a great situation. And eventually the situation with Rome sours too. Now, other things that you could get, there are a lot of birds, hares, rabbits, bunnies, small game animals. And these are being brought live into the city and then butchered and sold. Similarly, goats. Goats are everywhere in the ancient Mediterranean. If you've ever met a goat, they will eat anything. We used to live next to a family of billy goats who were slowly eating the innards of this classic 50s car. And over the course of a year, they had it down to like just the metal plates on the outside. Like, I think they'd eaten some of the springs even. And they were fine. It's nuts. Goats are incredible and delightful and adorable. In fact, like, if you're having a hard time this week, go to YouTube, Google baby goats. Baby goats are amazing. And, well, that makes this depressing then because we're talking about eating them. But yeah, goats are a regular sacrificial animal as well as an eaten animal. They are a nice combination of animals that'll eat everything, including waste. So a lot of what these animals are doing in the ancient city is not just serving as a source of food, but also as a disposal mechanism for surplus food, food waste, waste. But what this means is that you're eating pigs and goats that have been eating human refuse, sewage, and this means that the parasite load is massive. And we know this because when we look at that human poop I was mentioning earlier that we now analyze as an archaeological remain, we find eggs for all kinds of parasites. Folks were just riddled with them. Incidentally, one of the current hypotheses for why so many more people today are experiencing allergy reactions than in populations even 50. Gosh darn it, Tethys. Here you go. Here's a kitty. And Kitty's going to help me talk about parasites. Would you like to talk to the students about parasites? she would not. Because parasites put a load on your immune system as well as stealing your nutrients, we think that modern immune systems, because they don't have to deal with a parasite load and they were designed to handle a parasite load, part of what makes autoimmune diseases kick off is that the immune system is kind of spinning its wheels. It's looking for parasites. There aren't any parasites. It kind of freaks out and starts just randomly deciding that, peanuts are a parasite. And there we go. This is called the hygiene hypothesis. If you want to look it up, it's pretty interesting. Another hypothesis for why allergies and allergic reactions and autoimmune diseases are so much more common in people with a female body plan rather than a male body plan is that if you have a uterus, your body is made to be able to handle the existence of the placenta. And the placenta is, it's an organ your body grows, but it's also a foreign body because it's the interface between you and your fetus. So your immune system has to be able to recognize that the placenta is a placenta and not attack it for about 9 months or so. After that, it's fair game. Oh my God, I am not restarting my computer. Dear goodness, folks, I swear, my life right now. Go away. Go away. All right, restart tonight. Fine. What were we talking about? Placentas. So, because women on average are having fewer pregnancies over their lifetime, the idea goes that your immune system freaks out a little bit because it hasn't had enough placenta time. I don't know if I'm explaining this well. I'm not even sure that I buy this one, but if you're interested, check it out, see what you think. All right, where were we? We were talking about, oh yes, land animals. Ancient folks, and indeed anybody doing sensible, sustainable agriculture will tell you, James, really, that you should pick animals with multiple functions. Sheep, for this reason, are a real go-to because sheep provide wool, they provide meat, and they also provide milk. So they create a sustainable nutrition as they lactate. You can dress with them, and then you can still eat them when they're older. It's a little bit tougher as mutton, but it's still tasty. Similarly, goats also give milk, so goats are a preferred species for meat production. Now, rarely would you be able to get a hold of beef because beef is very resource intensive. Cows don't give you great wool. They can produce a whole lot of milk, but you have to feed them a lot compared to, say, goats and sheep. So beef and cow milk are going to be less accessible. Another one that you tend to see in the ancient world, especially in the north, is horse milk. Just like any other mammal, horses lactate, and they tend to produce a bit of a lactation surplus. So horse milk is on the menu. When we're talking the Mediterranean, we're talking a population with a high rate of adulthood lactose tolerance. And you may be familiar, lactose tolerance is a recent human adaptation. It's not the human default norm. I don't know if you can really talk about human defaults, but before this mutation, humans, like any other self-respecting mammal, stop being able to digest lactose when they're old enough not to need their mother's milk. One of the reasons why dairy forms such a big part of eating in the Mediterranean is that you have a population with a really high rate of lactose tolerance. Now, this doesn't mean that you're drinking a lot of fresh milk, because without refrigeration and pasteurization, that isn't safe. Now, this is not to say that raw milk is necessarily unsafe ipso facto. If you live near enough to a cow that you can... Jimmy, please. What were we saying? Living next to cows. Yes. You can drink the milk. it'll be mostly fine, except, and here's the big except, cows are a carrier species of Mycobacterium tuberculosis. May remember this from lecture 1. This is our buddy, the tuberculosis bacillus. It is a bacillus that attacks both animals and humans, and it can be transmitted animals, humans, humans, animals. And if you're in a city, you've got an even greater chance of getting it. Now, most of the transmission comes from air droplets in the respiratory system, but it also is shed in milk, especially cow milk. So if you drink milk from a cow with tuberculosis, you yourself can develop tuberculosis. And since you're drinking it rather than inhaling it, you're also at risk for developing an atypical kind of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis of the lymph nodes in your neck. It forms these ulcers called scrofula. Uh, Google image that if you like looking at gross stuff and body horror. It could be worse. We could be in a tuberculosis pandemic. Actually, we kind of are, but oh god. Right. Back to the happy escapist stuff. We're talking about milk. Yes. Now, this isn't something that ancient people knew about, right? They didn't know about tuberculosis milk, but they did know that milk spoils rather quickly and that you can have severe illness from eating milk that isn't shelf stable and isn't fresh enough. For this reason, milk was associated with country folk. Mediterranean people saw it as an uncivilized kind of thing that people from Northern Europe would eat. And this happens because Northern Europe is cold enough that milk keeps for longer, but because humans are kind of shitty to each other and a little xenophobic, if you asked a Roman, they'd say, oh man, those idiot barbarians in the north drink milk. We don't do that. We're Romans. And I'm sure they'd use a West Virginia accent to say it. I'm not sure why I'm going there. This doesn't mean, however, that dairy products aren't a thing. Romans love cheese. Greeks love cheese. Everybody loves cheese who can eat it. Sorry if you can't. Because cheese is de-frickin-licious. And not just cheese, but yogurts, fermented milk products too. So things like milk-based kefirs. But yogurty type drink things are a big part of Mediterranean diets. So dairy is going to be one of your major ways to get protein and also one of several go-to sources of calcium. You're drinking a lot of bone broth too, which can also be a good calcium source. Marrow also gives you rich fats and a lot of return on your investment, nutritionally speaking. Now, seafood is also huge. We used to think this was just a thing that you could get when you were close to the shore, but we find people eating seafood deep inland. Again, poop studies. Now, this is because fish could be preserved in salt by smoking, and it was really super popular, but that's not the only way you eat fish in the ancient world. Let me tell you about the Romans' favorite condiment. What are you doing? Garum. Garum is Roman fish sauce. If you've ever eaten Thai food, you've had fish sauce. It's super delicious because the breakdown products of pretty much any food, including fish sauce, creates free glutamic acid. Free glutamic acid is the chemical component that makes MSG. And if you're not sensitive to it, I happen to be. Like, I'm not making this up. I'm one of the very rare people who has a legit, confirmed, scientifically tested MSG sensitivity, which means I can't eat fucking anything. Thank you for listening. But MSG is freaking delicious, and I really miss it. So, yes, I'm not saying this because I hate it. I'm saying this because I can't. But if you are so lucky as to be able to eat free glutamic acid, go you. You're in the majority. Most humans can tolerate this perfectly well. Yeah, it's mostly those of us who have severe neurological illnesses because it is an excitatory compound to your nervous system. Your body feels it coming and it gets like this rush from it. Romans adored this stuff. So here's how you make Roman garum. You take small fish, like guppy-sized fish. This is fish that otherwise would be waste fish, like anchovies and things. You dry it in the sun and then you let it rot. So the stomach juices from the fish, as they decompose, break down the body tissues of the fish until it forms this kind of brown sludgy concentrate. You strain that and it makes an oily browned compound that you would then keep in a little glass bottle. We have so many of these glass bottles because, again, Romans love this shit. And then you put it on everything. We have ancient cookbooks. They did put that shit on everything because, gosh darn it, fish sauce is freaking delicious. It's used as a straight up condiment, as a cooking additive. People dip their bread in it. So it may sound a little gross just explaining how you get it, but it's not an unhygienic thing. The salt acts as a preservative. The parasite load isn't high. It's one of the more benign things that you can go eating in the ancient world. So if you don't have a neurological disease and you find yourself in ancient Rome, get you some fish sauce. If you're around today, go down to H Mart. You can find some. It sounds like he wants some. He's not getting any. I'm not going to the grocery store. Social distancing is important. What were we talking about? Yes, right. So other than eating garum, small fish end up put onto bread preparations with cheese. We get an early precursor to the pizza in ancient Rome. There's no tomato because tomato is a New World product, but bread with cheese and fish and toppings and things baked until it's kind of cheesy is a thing that you can have in ancient Rome. But then they're also put into stews, into bread dips, into little relish mixtures. Now, shellfish are also huge. Romans love it. You can get it in the Mediterranean. And again, if it's preserved right, it'll be safe. But we also have a lot of Romans getting sick from eating poorly prepared, contaminated shellfish. If you're in the ancient world, shellfish isn't safe. You just shouldn't. Say no to Roman oysters is my advice there. Yes. Squids, tentacled things, cuttlefish. They love them because they're tasty. They also might be sentient though, so I have some feelings about eating them. I try not to, but they're tasty. When pickled in vinegar, they make this nice cold salad. You can still get this if you go to the Mediterranean. Insalata di mare. Really good. Highly recommend. Next up, wine. Oh, wine is a big one for the ancient Mediterranean. Now, this isn't the only alcoholic beverage you're getting. You can also have a form of mead. So you've seen this mentioned a couple times in your texts already. Hydromel is a mixture of honey and water, and it can either be drunk fermented or unfermented. The honey acts as both a preservative, but it can also be a sanitary measure to a point. Honey applied topically also is a great disinfectant. So if society collapses and somebody got cut, put some honey on it. It's a great idea. Honey we're still using in medical applications. So this isn't even alternative medicine anymore. This is like actual medicine. Maybe boil it first just in case there's salmonella in it. But yeah, honey is fantastic, and it's really good for coughs. Like if you don't have a jar of honey, in a socially responsible way, go get you some. Like order it off the internet maybe. Yeah, so what we're talking about, wine then is your major beverage. Very few people are drinking their water straight in antiquity, but also drinking wine straight was considered tacky, but it seems a lot of people were doing it because ancient people are constantly complaining about other people drinking their wine unwatered. Like, they never drank their wine unwatered. So if you want to be a judgy ancient Roman, this is something you'd be judgy about. We also find Romans complaining about foreign non-Roman people drinking their wine pure, and then like people who aren't Roman complain about Romans drinking their wine pure. So everybody was drinking it pure, but it wasn't the way you were supposed to drink it on a daily basis, both because ancient wine was much more alcoholic than modern wine. Dude, no, that's your daddy's Shinerbach. I don't let my baby drink beer. We're safe. I got it. There's not even anything left in it. But you're trouble. Yeah, you are. What have you got? Okay. Okay, cool. What were we doing? We're talking about alcohol. Alcohol. Yeah, I know what I'm doing after this lecture. Right. You would mix your wine with water, both because the wine was a lot more alcoholic than modern wine, at least alcoholic enough that if you threw it on a flame, it would cause the flame to flare rather than to extinguish. So that's a pretty high alcohol content. You would, at fancy parties, play drinking games where you decide how much water you're going to put in the wine. Eventually, there wouldn't be a lot of water in the wine, if you know what I mean. But on a day-to-day basis, your go-to drink would be wine or a little bit of vinegar in your water, and that's for safety. Now, they didn't know about safe drinking water per se, but they did know that if you drank water straight, there was a high probability that you'd get gastrointestinal symptoms, you'd get diarrhea, you'd have cramping, and that you could get very, very sick from drinking your water straight. So putting wine in it sanitizes it and makes it safer. Not safe, but safer. For that reason, when a baby was first weaned in the ancient world, where did you get that hanger? I don't want to know. I'm lecturing. Right. When your baby got to be weaned, and this was usually about the age of 2, mostly wouldn't have worked for this one, but on the go, then you would have your baby's first wine in a little commemorative jug. Like they make these tiny little, like this big baby wine jugs for baby's first drink. It just tells you just how much has changed. And very recently too, like in the early 20th century, before Prohibition in the United States, one of the regular ways beer was advertised was as a safe drink for babies. You would like put it in the baby's bottle and it would give your baby nutrition and calm them down. Just to be clear, I don't let my baby drink. Please don't call CPS. That's probably very unwise. Yeah, he drinks water and juice and sometimes tea. Why are baby toys so irritating? Focus, Jones Lewis, focus. Right. We were talking about, yes, baby wine. This meant that over the course of the day, you'd keep a flask on you, you'd be drinking from it. There were wine shops where you could stop and get some watered wine. This meant that folks in the ancient world were consuming a lot of alcohol, but not necessarily drunk all the time. It would explain a lot if they were, but they don't seem to have been. Rather, most of what you're drinking is a little bit of wine to sanitize your water, and that's how you stay hydrated. Now, hydromel, I think I got like halfway through this. So hydromel, you mix rainwater with honey, you let it stand for a little bit. Sometimes you throw in a dash of salt, and this is your go-to hydration drink. It's also your go-to drink for sick people. It was calorie dense, it stays down on your stomach if your stomach's upset, and it makes a really good way to get fluids into somebody who needs them pretty urgently. And it also gives them calories, electrolytes. It's delicious. Bees are fantastic. Pardon me. That's enough. Ugh. I'm a killjoy. Right. We've talked about wine. Cool. Now, When fermented, oh gosh, he's figured out how to turn it on. He's evolved. No, this slide's already too long. I've got to keep going. Okay. Right, what were we doing? Wine, honey, herbs. Retsina. So another way that you would preserve your wine, because ancient wines weren't made like modern wines with sulfates, which is part of what keeps it shelf stable. Also, we now pasteurize beer, thus killing the microbes that are used to ferment. Ancient alcohol, they didn't do that. There's no pasteurization, there's no heating. This isn't necessarily a bad thing because it means that you're getting active cultures of good bacteria most of the time when you're drinking these alcohols, but it also means they're not shelf stable for a long time. Now, one of the ways that you'd fix that was by preserving it with resin from a pine tree. You would also, and this is less wholesome, add lead. Lead does sanitize your wine, but it's lead. You shouldn't drink lead. But the reason they went for lead and not for, say, other metallic compounds is that lead tastes sweet. This is why kids with paint chips are such a problem. The paint chips taste sweet. Romans would use this as an artificial sweetener as well as a wine additive. And they seem to really like their wine sweet. They put a lot of honey in it too. And when we get to the pharmacy section, we'll talk about other things that Romans put in their wine. Well, not just Romans, Greeks, Carthaginians, everyone in the Mediterranean. It was a fun time for substance abuse. Okay. Okay, we've covered what we need to cover now about drunkenness and wine. On to eggs and dairy. We've talked about dairy, so we're good there. Eggs are a great source of protein. They're renewable. A chicken during its lifetime is going to produce hundreds, nay, thousands of eggs. They're really easy to keep. Chickens eat just about anything. You can keep them in a very small space. So even if you're in an urban apartment, you'd probably be keeping chickens on your balcony or in your courtyard. When you imagine ancient cities, imagine them not just with a bunch of people, but also animals in the street, pigs, goats, dogs, chickens. There's not great sanitation either. Now, as we have learned recently, and well, we've done this for a while, this is a great way to transmit diseases from animal hosts to humans and back again. It's not a great model for produce, but it does ensure freshness, and fresh eggs are freaking delicious. These would be boiled, pickled, in vinegar, preserved with sweeteners like honey. It was used for pack-out lunches. Eggs are something that you're going to be eating a lot of if you're stuck in the ancient world. On to the specialty items, and I'm including these because they show up in your readings a couple of times. Kukaon is a word, a generic word for... Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to come? No, you don't want to come here. Oh, God. All right. Steady on, Jones. Steady on. What was I talking about? Kukaon, yes. This is your ancient insurer, essentially. So this is a barley-based drink, often with watered wine. So you start with your base of watered wine, you add a little bit of honey, and then barley water. So if you're not familiar, barley, when soaked in water, creates this very thick, dissolved consistency. The barley itself expands and breaks down as it expands, and then it suspends itself in this nice colloidal sort of mixture. So what you get is a nice, thick, belly-filling liquid. And you can add flavorings to this, herbs, wine, honey, a lot of honey. These tend to be sweet, sometimes also a little bit of yogurt. And this would have been what you ate when you were out doing work and you needed a fast meal. You could buy these in stalls too. Wine stalls were also a thing. If you're living in an urban situation, most of your food is going to come from commercial eateries and bars. And this isn't just because city people are lazy, but this is because fire is incredibly unsafe. Still, fire in an ancient city, super unsafe, yeah? If you're living in an apartment building before like building codes or fire escapes, a lot of them were built really super shittily by slumlords. You've got a lot of wood drying out slowly in the hot Mediterranean sun. If you're cooking with open flame or coals in that situation, you're going to cause fire. So in order to keep fire from being too unsafe, ancient cities tended to confine cook fires to purpose-built cafeterias. Thermopolia is a hot food establishment, bakeries. Now, this isn't something that's necessarily legislated, but this is something the community did to help reduce fire risk. And it kind of worked. Still, ancient cities burned down on the regular, so by kind of worked, I mean like you have a major fire every decade or so. Which is better than every year, yes, I think. Alright, finally, a brief note about medical diets. So what I've had you read for today is the Hippocratic Regimen for Health, and you're also going to be reading Galen's Exercise with a Small Ball to talk about physical fitness. Regimen for Health is one of several manuals on how to choose your diet and exercise in order to prevent as well as treat illnesses, mostly prevent. This is the mainstay of ancient medicine. A lot of ancient medicine is preventive, and ancient doctors would regularly be called not just to take care of emergency situations, but as consultants for diet, exercise, these sort of wellness interventions. And it's interesting that we're now starting to move back in that direction because it is a good way to approach health. And this includes things like bathing, sanitation as well, but also massage, body work. All of this would be part of what you would do if you could to keep your ancient body functional. Really? The exercise for this unit that I've given you to help you kind of think about what this would look like on a practical scale includes some clients who are wealthy, some clients who are enslaved. So one of the important questions I'd like you to ask when you're reading Regimen for Health, an exercise with a small ball, is who is this written for? How much of this exercise is going to be practical for working class folks, for enslaved folks, for people living in urban areas versus rural areas, for people with large families, small families, because all of these, what we now call social factors of health, are incredibly important to looking at how one's access to wellness works, and also how someone's risk of preconditions for poor health outcomes are in large part determined by factors that are outside of their control. And this is still something we're thinking about in modern medicine as we become more cognizant that, you know, if you're wealthy, yeah, you can buy high quality ingredients, you can eat organic. If you don't have to hold down a job that takes large hours out of your day, you're going to have time to make all of your meals. If you're wealthy enough to have a stay-at-home parent, then that stay-at-home parent can do a lot to improve the quality of your diet. But if you live in a food desert, if you work a job that's demanding with a lot of hours, if you're from an area with poor air quality, if you are on a budget that only allows you to buy certain kinds of groceries, then all of this. Oh, and I forgot a big one. Your stress load. Stress load is an incredibly important part of health and access to health. And people who are worrying about where their next paycheck is coming from, who's going to take care of their parents if they get sick, whether they can afford health care for their child or not, whether they can afford to go to a personal trainer, whether they're going to get shot this week because they live in a high violence area. All of this is something that you don't have a ton of control over that increases your stress load. And then also irregular hours. One thing, goodness baby, one thing that has really changed since the ancient world is that our work culture now is timed to clocks, to working days, and to shifts. And it's also very irregular. This means that more and more people are living with a sleep schedule that doesn't fit their body's needs. And this is a problem. Now, this is not to say that ancient people didn't have this happen too, especially if you're enslaved and made to do night work. You're not going to be sleeping on your own schedule. But for most people in the ancient world, especially working class farmers, have to get up and sleep with the sun pretty much. But a lot of ancient people have some flexibility in when they rest, when they take breaks. Not everything that the modern world has introduced to our health environment is a good thing. A lot of it's good. I love modern medicine, guys. Modern medicine is freaking fantastic. You know I'm a huge fan. But there are some lessons still to be had from looking at the ancient world and imagining a world in which we let people get some goddamn sleep, yeah? Okay, and with that, the end of this very long slide. I'm not recording this again, so you're just going to have to put up with my noisy child. I'm so sorry. I'll do the rest of this at nap time. I love you. Thank you for your patience.
Oh boy. Thank you for sticking with me there. We're going to look at a couple of artifacts real quick and then move on a bit because, gosh, we're 47 minutes into this already. Here are a few cooking setups that have survived from ancient Greece. These are all from the Agora Museum in Athens, and they're pretty typical for courtyard cooking setups. So this is if you have a large enough urban house that you have an open courtyard area open to the air, and usually there's some kind of a yard where you keep your chickens and your pigs and maybe a little garden. In Roman houses, this tends to be in the back, but again, and I can't emphasize this enough, only if you're pretty darn wealthy. We're not talking like 1% are wealthy, but we're talking high status folks. So the one on the left is a real deluxe model here. This is a multiple burner range. At the very bottom, you see there's a little opening. It's broken away some, but you can still see that's one of the areas where you can put coals, and then the entire ceramic body of the stove heats up. And then you can move other coals to the tray area on the next level up. And the griddle that's in there is a metal, actually is that metal? Sorry, no, that's a ceramic griddle. We also find them in metal forms, occasionally with kind of leaded iron substance, which is lovely. That's what you use to grill your meats, your seafoods, whatever you want to grill. Over top of that is a flatbread pan. That's also ceramic. All of this is terracotta. And then you have multiple burners for different porridges, and the one in the back on the very, very small burner is most likely for heating your wine. Some wines they like to drink warm. Often the water for the wine was warmed too, and then that would allow you to infuse more herbs and spices into the mix as well. Wine drinking was pretty obsessive. So for less fancy families, you have something more like what we're looking at on the right-hand side of the slide. At the very bottom is a small contained cooker. The coals go in the bottom pot, and on the top you cook your stew that you dip your shop-bought bread into. And this is the kind of thing that you could use in an ancient apartment building, but I strongly recommend you don't. It's fire hazard. This didn't stop people, but it's fire hazard. You at least weren't supposed to. But we also see them in rural context too. This is a pretty standard stove setup. Very few houses had built-in kitchens. That was a real luxury, and that's what your one-percenter kitchen looked like. And of course, the one-percenters aren't cooking in that kitchen. They're enslaving people to cook in those kitchens. Up at the top, this gives you an idea of what cooking might have looked like. This is a figurine, another one of these agaras pieces, and it's showing a probably woman. It's not 100% clear that that's what's going on because we see that hairdo also on young men and figures of Apollo, but probably this is a woman bent over a stew pot, and that pedestal is where the pipe of the stove is. It's a similar shape to the luxury stove on the left. You can kind of see how that works. Here's a little bit of other food art. Really, this is a bottomless category that you can go out and find for yourself, just Googling Greek or Roman food and Google imaging your heart out. But this gives you some idea of what food looked like in various stages of preparation. The bottom two slides, especially the one on the left, is food in the final stages of preparation. So the animals are dead, but the feathers are off of the probably chicken. There are also some dates and what looks like fennel or asparagus, some shellfish. On the right-hand side, you have a still life on the bottom with a cook's shelf in a fancy house, and there are game birds hung by the beak. Often, before plucking, you would hang the game birds for a day or so, and that would cause the feathers to release. They're easier to pluck, and that would also cause enough decomposition that the tough, small tissues would break down a little bit, and this also made game bird eating not particularly safe, but as you can see, this isn't stopping people in the ancient world, or indeed today. We eat unsafe food all the time. Please don't. Right, the other thing that's going on in the bottom left-hand slide, you see a picture there, and then this kind of reverse conical vessel with a big stirring spoon. That's for the wine. So the beaker on the right is a mixing vessel. It's a really small crater is the word for this in Greek. We get the word crater from it, like asteroids, craters. That dull metallic color that's a little less shiny than the other vessels, that's a high lead content pewter or silver vessel, probably pewter. The other vessels likely have a higher silver content, but they're likely also pewter with a little bit of lead. You have a higher lead content in the wine mixing vessel because as the warm wine in the water mixes against the sides of the vessel, a little bit of the lead leaches into that warm water and sweetens the flavor of the wine with the delicious, delicious taste of lead. And I can't emphasize this enough. That is really unsafe. A really good question, and one that's still open in research circles, is how bad was lead poisoning in the ancient world, and how many people were mentally compromised by chronic lead poisoning? Now, I've said a lot about lead contamination, but we need to take a step back here a bit, because while Roman-era lead levels are very high, they're not as high as, say, the United States from the 1950s through the 1970s due to the addition of tetraethyl lead in gasoline, that unleaded part of gasoline that we no longer use because it's super unsafe. What this did was it caused a form of highly bioavailable lead to be released into the air, into the water, onto touchable surfaces, and this caused a massive uptick in chronic lead poisoning throughout the industrialized world. It's still a problem in areas where tetraethyl lead is not fully banned from vehicles. Now, this is compounded in areas where the water in the pipes is causing lead leaching. We're going to talk about this a little more going forwards. That is not one of the major contributors of lead poisoning in the ancient world. Most of it you're getting through cosmetics and food consumption. Bone lead levels are high enough that we can generally tell when an area has become part of a Roman lifestyle world. I don't say Romanized anymore because that's a complicated and scholarly sketchy concept. But we do see both higher environmental lead levels due to the massive amounts of mining and lead processing going on. It caused an environmental crisis so bad that ancient authors noticed. One of the reasons I love Pliny the Elder is he's an early whistleblower on the dangers of mine leaching and poisoning. Because I love him. I'm sorry, he's my ancient best friend. Oh, what were we talking about? Food. Yes, right, lead. More about the lead water later. We still have to talk about the image at the top of the slide. You'll notice that this food is looking a little bit more processed. There's what appears to be a chopped leek stalk, some maybe onions or garlic cloves, a pig's trotter, and organ meat. That's likely a pig's stomach. It might also be a cow's stomach. Organ meat was commonly eaten and not quite as safe as other bits of animal. If you get it fresh, it's not too bad, but even so. But what's going on in this particular mosaic? It's from a floor, and this particular floor owner seems to have put into his dining room a floor that was pre-littered with little bits of food, so that if you drop food on the floor, don't worry about it, it'll just blend in with the carpet, which is just fantastic. I'm sitting here in a room that's been destroyed by a toddler, and I can tell you that I'd be less bothered by it if my carpet were patterned with Lego blocks. Okay, we've talked a little bit about meat sourcing, so I'm not going to belabor this, but I've given you some images of the sourcing process. At the top, there's a rural sacrifice scene. You can tell it's rural both because there's a plant. It's not necessarily as indicative as you might think, though, because many urban temple districts would keep trees, but it's a small altar. The folks doing the sacrifice aren't particularly fancy. The garlands that they're wearing are part of the prayer ritual. When you go to pray to the gods, you wore a flower crown, sometimes a grain crown. It was themed to the season and the god. So that's both part of your party culture, but also part of your religious life. So flower crowns, totally acceptable religious wear for both men and women in the ancient Mediterranean. Okay, fine. This is a bonus fact. It's not going to show up on anything, but I think it's kind of funny. So here we go. Apparently, there were some Romans who really hated people who wore flower crowns to inappropriate places. Like they thought, okay, flower crowns are for religious festivals and for drinking parties, but like, you don't wear your party hat to the supermarket, right? It's a little bit like, I don't know, wearing an evening gown to class. Actually, that sounds awesome. Nevertheless, some Romans got really bent out of shape about people wearing wreaths in public in the day, and they're not praying. What the hell? So they tried to ban it. And there was this one guy who was caught up in a lawsuit because he walked out onto his porch in the daylight still wearing his flower crown, and he totally got in trouble. We know about this from Pliny the Elder, by the way. I love that man. Right. The scene at the bottom is a fancier sacrifice, but again, still probably rural, and it's interesting because this is one of, if not the earliest surviving paintings from the ancient world, at least the ancient Greek-speaking world. They were found in a cave, and in preservation contexts that kept the wood from rotting. So that back panel's made out of wood, and this is encaustic painting. It's kind of a glazed painting, and this gives you an idea of what Greek art looks like when it's not on a vase. It's so cool. It's also got some very early Greek lettering. If you've taken Greek, you might notice that some of these letters you may not be familiar with. There's a Kaf right in there, and I think there's a digamma on there somewhere, which will interest none of you except for, like, Chris. Is Chris in this? Yeah, Chris Dale. Although Chris, Tucker, are you taking Greek too? I don't know. Shout out to the Chris's. Love you guys. All right, moving on. Here's one of these bakeries. Oh my gosh, the baby's awake. Hold on. Oh my goodness, guys! Lecture Buddy's back! Look at him. He just grew eye teeth today. They're poking out. Do you want to show them? No? Okay. Let's tell them about thermopolia. Yeah, thermopolia. All right. Bedtime story, Jimmy. This is a Roman bakery. There's a shopkeeper behind the counter, and you can see stacks and stacks of loaves on the table. Do you see how they have those scores? They're kind of this round, puffy shape. Those were put into the loaves before baking by impressing the dough with string or rope, and this made them ready for pre-tearing. So these are loaves that are made to be shared, kind of look like little pizza pies. And then let me move this video out of the way so that you guys can see the thermopolium. That's the picture on the bottom right. Right there, Jim Jims. Yeah. Now, this is a thermopolium in Pompeii, and each of those little depressions is part of a burner system. So you'd put ceramic or metal containers in there, and then you'd keep stew simmering all day. And if you lived in a city, most of your meals you'd buy in the thermopolium. You'd buy a bowl of stew, and you'd have your loaf of bread from the baker's down the street, and then you just hang out in the thermopolium or on the street and eat your food, or you'd take it back to your apartment and finish it later. This got to be a location where folks would hang out to form early versions of trade unions, but also kind of organized crime as well. It's a bit sketchy. Again, most of our sources are elite, so elites are going to elite. So in some cities, thermopolia were temporarily or permanently shut down as places to gather. You could just go there and get your food. You couldn't, like, hang out and plot sedition. Go plot sedition, guys. It's fun. But do it in online environments because social distancing saves lives. Yes, it does. Doesn't it? Next slide. Aha! Here is Dr. Kuttner posing at a thermopolium in Pompeii. Alas, I was going to replace this with a picture from our Italy trip this spring. On the scale of things to be upset about, the rate's kind of low. I'm sorry, Italy. Hopefully we'll get to go there next year. I don't know. Do you want a drink? Here, have a drink. Nonetheless, enjoy the thermopolium. Let's move on, chat. Okie dokie. Now, within this food culture, there was a thing called the symposium, which for our purposes, we need to discuss in the context of binge drinking and binge eating. But this was also an important way for elites to socially network with other elites, but also for upwardly mobile people to get in good with the elites. This was something that starts as a Greek phenomenon, although versions of it existed in Near Eastern cultures too. Greece didn't invent the drinking party, but they certainly popularized this form of it. But Etruscans were really into it. Romans eventually pick up a version of this, and different Romans have different ideas about what's appropriate, but broad strokes here. This involved drinking competitions and drinking games that were designed to get you slowly and completely inebriated. Depending on the time and place and the social milieu, there may or may not be women who are guests. Often you would hire professional musicians and entertainers. At naughty symposia, this would involve sex workers too. Then frequently also you would have your waiters serving you naked, which is what's going on the left-hand image here. I'm sorry, don't look. Okay, fine, you can look. Yes, he's not wearing his diaper. That's not good. Right. What I have this image for here, though, is not the naked waiter, but the shape of this image. Do you see this round disc shape? That is typical of a kind of ceramic vessel that's called the kylix. And that's what you use to drink wine at these fancy parties. Although sometimes you also use drinking horns, which is what's going on the right with the topless lady and probably a dude. The round figure was put on the bottom of the drinking vessel, and you can see what the full drinking vessel looks like by looking in the left hand of the waiter. So he's dipping the pitcher into the crater, the mixing bowl, to pull out the water mixed with wine, and then in his left hand he has the cup he's about to pour the watered wine into. Now, it's got a round bottom, which is what this picture is on. So the idea here is that this is in the bottom of your drinking bowl. Let's see, hold my hand up with the drinking bowl, yeah. Or say my ladybug cup. And then as you quaff, you slowly reveal the picture at the bottom of the drinking bowl, but you're not done yet. Because ancient wine wasn't strained and it wasn't pasteurized, so there's a lot of gloppy grape skin bits and bug bits and products of fermentation. We call that wine lees, and this sludge kind of hangs out on the bottom of your wine bowl. So in order to get that off so you can see the hidden picture at the bottom of your wine cup, you would play a game called Cotabos, where you and all of your drunk friends would, say, pick a target in the middle of the party room or a place on the wall, and you'd hold up your drinking vessel like so, with the loop of the kylix up around your finger, and then you would fling like that. And then the slurpy wine glugs would hit the target, and whoever missed had to take an extra drink. This is ancient beer pong, only it's not beer, it's wine, sometimes with like opium in it, or cannabis, or both, or mandrake. I mean, it gets really unsafe. So this combination of binge eating foods, often that aren't prepared in safe environments and have sat around being warm for a while, including like shellfish and pork products, and then you're drinking a bunch of wine, this tends to lead to sickness. And that's the context in which a lot of the advice in Regimen has to be read, but also stuff you saw in the epidemics too. If you remember that one guy where the Hippocratic author is super judgy, like, oh yeah, he went out to a drinking party and he made himself sick and now he's dead. Yeah, it's judgy, but it's also probably what happened, because you can die from acute food poisoning, and you can definitely die from acute food poisoning combined with alcohol poisoning, which is to say, enjoy your social distancing responsibly. You're too young. You can't have any wine. You cannot. You can have Tylenol. Okay. Yes, about that winemaking process. Up on the left, you can see two characters from a Roman mosaic making wine in a wine press, smishing it with their feet. The feet are part of what make the wine wine. They're natural yeasts in human skin. So the process of plonking feet into grapes and smushing them and then waiting for them to ferment is that the bacteria from the human skin, as well as the bacteria falling down from the sky, because you'd leave it open while you were doing this, would create the fermentation reaction that you would then halt. Wine was shipped long distances in vessels called amphorae, which is what you're looking at on the right, these kind of like two-sided stirrupy vessels. The little pointy bit at the bottom helps them to interlock with each other and not break on long sea voyages. We find tons of these because lots of ships sink in the Mediterranean, and terracotta survives real well. And we also find them in dumps outside of ancient cities. This produced a huge amount of waste, absolutely massive. Now, this wasn't pasteurized wine. It wasn't shelf stable. It didn't have sulfites. So after much less time than today, your wine would start to turn into vinegar. So in order to halt this process, the seals on the amphorae were often covered with wax that had been dipped in. I'll give you 3 guesses. If one of them is lead, you are correct. It is lead, which would act as a preservative if you're into that. Oh, right! I have a picture about kotabos. Here's some ancient people playing kotabos. Awesome. Look at them. Aren't they party animals? The bottom picture, by the way, is from an Etruscan tomb. Some people were so into this party culture that the thing they have on their tomb walls to show that they're elite fancy people who get to have nice elite fancy tombs is pictures of them at a drinking party forever and ever and ever and ever into eternity with like enslaved musicians and their wife. Interestingly, most mainland Greeks didn't think it was appropriate to have. Some of them, no women at all. Some of them were like, okay, but only women who aren't citizen women. They were super judgy about the Etruscans because Etruscan citizen women came to the party. Pretty badass, actually. We found skeletons from Etruria that from sexing the skeletons, I don't know if we've confirmed this with DNA, but the sex of the skeletons are female and they're buried with armor. One of them with probably male skeleton in the corner wearing jewelry. So Etruscans, fantastic folk, except for like the slavery. Now, if this sounds like a toxic feast culture to you, with the binge drinking and the food poisoning and the sexual exploitation and the naked waiters, and if you ever wondered if modern people are being super unfair by being judgy about ancient people's culture, I don't think it's that unfair because ancient people really pushed back against this kind of toxic party culture. Some of them for very different reasons. Some people thought that it was bad for your morals, that it was excessive, that it made elites too drunk to do serious man business. But also there are religious traditions that try to upend the social order of feasts. We're looking at one here. This is from an early Christian grave, and it's showing the love feast, which was an early Christian rite that we think is a kind of beta test 1.0 version of communion rites today. And here, everyone sits around a round table rather than a square arrangement of couches in order that they all be equal. In the symposium, you would regularly sit by rank, and it was really clear who was in charge of whom. Here, everyone's equal at the table. The person serving is dressed like the people at the table. There's not a huge difference in heights. They all seem to be dudes. But the other thing is they're all eating bread, and there's a little dip pot in the middle that's probably got stew or hummus or something. So they're eating a very simple meal, The wine pitcher that's being brought from the side is very small. It's really de-emphasized. This isn't the only alternative drinking culture thing, by the way. Pythagoreans had an alternative version. Um, I was just thinking of another one. Interestingly, the rites of Dionysus seem to have been an alternative drinking party culture too, which might strike you as a bit odd. But the way that alternative party culture worked was, first, there was no distinction of rank. So enslaved people are partying as equals with elite people. Men and women and non-binary people, for that matter, are all hanging out together, equal participants in the rite. And because of this, it got banned in Rome quite a few times. It was considered really sketchy, and yet it was super duper popular. Clearly, a lot of people were hungry for a feast culture that didn't necessarily reinforce the kind of norms that elite culture thought needed enforced. And that's interesting to me. It points to a place where we see ancient people resisting some of the harmful trends in their own culture and creating spaces where there is more equality and there is healthier behavior, sort of. Um, Rites of Dionysus did have a lot of unhealthy behavior, though, so you're still going to get alcohol poisoning there, and you might get really drunk and rip up a goat. No, 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 not helpful. Thank you, though. Thank you. Are you ready to go back to bed? I think he looks tired. See you on the next slide. Oh. Alrighty, here we are at an aqueduct course. Now, one of the good news items in the ancient world is that they did figure out that drinking water with a lot of sewage in it is very, very bad for you. Now, it's not that they quite understood why. Without germ theory, you can't. You can get kind of close, though, and if you're familiar with the Broad Street Pump incident, if not, like, Google Jon Snow and ignore the Game of Thrones stuff. It's a really good story that is irrelevant here. Suffice to say, access to water that has been taken upstream of much human habitation, including agricultural runoff, animal feces, silting, dead bodies, all of that great stuff. The solution to this was to run a gradient from a reservoir outside of the city to the city proper. Now, we think of this as a Roman thing because Romans funded these things in a big way, both for practical reasons, but also as a way to keep their military busy. One of the problems with a standing army is that if you don't give them something to do, they'll find something to do, and you probably won't like it. Roman armies did enough of that already, and it caused more than a few resistance movements, and good on them, really, because Roman legionaries could get super out of hand. So one of the things they would have you do is build aqueducts. There was a corps of engineers taken out of the household of the emperor. This began as a group of people who had been enslaved by the emperor, who were freed, but as former enslaved people still had a strong relationship to the imperial household and didn't have enough rank to threaten the emperor personally. So this was the core of ancient Roman civil service, and this was one of the ways that Romans staffed its engineering. This included two people from elite families who weren't quite elite enough to be senators, but who had had a thorough education, who were qualified for military command. These often became aqueduct and mine inspectors. Interestingly, this seems to be one of the jobs Pliny the Elder had during his life. It's a theme to this lecture. Right, so here we're looking at the Pont du Gard. This is an aqueduct still standing in modern-day France, ancient Gaul, and it's not exactly what you see on the diagram. The diagram here gives you the basic parts of a Roman aqueduct. The idea is that you create a gradient that's not so steep that the water flows at a rate that destroys the structure of the water channel, but is not so slight that the water stops flowing. You just want to keep a constant, gentle gradient flow. But in order to do that, you have to start in the mountains and then go towards the city and not break that gradient. Okay, so what do you do if you have a valley, say, as you do here with the Pont du Gard? Well, you can either build a bridge, which is what we're looking at, or you can create an underground siphon, which is on the diagram, where they would create an airtight channel. They would cover it under the ground, and they would run it from one end to the other. Now, most of an aqueduct's course is not one of these fancy pants bridges. Rather, they were dug through mountains. And Romans would try their best to go through mountains as much as possible because it was just more stable over time, not because it was safer for the people building it. The people who were sent to dig and maintain the channels were almost entirely enslaved folks. Maybe some low-ranking military personnel, but for the really dangerous stuff, enslaved people, many of them children. And they'd be sent to not just dig out the channels in the first place, but this is a system where if something gets stuck in it, it's going to be a real problem. If there's an earthquake, you're going to have to go in and fix it. So there are air shafts that people can be lowered into to kind of unstick things that have gotten stuck. Dead animals happen a lot. Algae blooms. Think of untreated water and you get the idea. Now, often these channels would form a calcium deposit. This is a good news, bad news situation. The bad news is that somebody had to regularly be lowered into the course of an aqueduct to chip the calcium deposits off the inside of the shafts. But these mineral deposits would coat the inside of the watercourse, keeping it smooth, and then when it got to the city, they would also coat the inside of the pipes. This is important because, next slide. Oh, well, I'll tell you on the slide after this why that's important, so stay tuned, it's a cliffhanger. Here we are on the top of the Pont du Gard looking at the flow channel, and you can see in the distance the channel's covered with tiles. The section right in front of you, though, is left uncovered. When you went up to do maintenance on the aqueduct, you climbed up the sticking out bricks on the side, and then you would have to lift up the panels and then dredge out the channel. Now, this is done on bridges that are high above the ground in river valleys. The wind shear is immense. This is really super dangerous. So it's not any better than the people getting lowered into the mountainsides. Now, if everybody survives and the water makes it to the city, it goes into a distributing tower, which is what you're looking at on the bottom right-hand picture in the slide. This is missing a lot of its walls. This would have been a large drum-shaped building, really quite high. What you're looking at is the very bottom part of it, where the water mains would branch off from this tank and then go into the city. So this tank is still above the city gravity-wise. This entire system runs on a gravity feed. And where you see the holes there used to be pipes. These large main pipes were made out of terracotta clay. Sometimes metal would be involved, but for the really big pipes, terracotta. And if you ever go to an archaeological site in the Mediterranean, you're almost certainly going to see some of them exposed. Look on roadways and pathways that have been partially excavated, and you'll see these sides of pipes, a little bit like our large water main PVC pipes today. And that's a delivery pipe. Now, they're also used for drainage pipes, and the difference is sometimes just where it's placed and how the system is run. So about those pipes, haha, the answer is lead. Behold, a lead pipe. So this is the picture right up there at the top right-hand corner where there's a little bit of clover. What you're looking at is an area of urban street. I think I took this in Corinth, if I remember correctly. The fountain house on the picture below is the fountain house in Corinth. So right up above there, you can see an area where there are two marble paving stones. Between those paving stones, the lead pipe has been wedged. Now, lead was used because it can be manipulated at normal temperature, right? You don't have to heat it up to forge it. And you can also crimp it and solder it at very low temperatures. This makes it ideal as a moldable, fungible, and also recyclable item. Now, for small water pipes, you need something that's flexible. You need something that doesn't get damaged in earthquakes too easily. You need something that's modular, but you also need something that's going to be watertight. Lead does all of this. But Professor, you might object, it's a horrible thing to put lead in pipes and water. Like, didn't that contribute to lead poisoning? Interestingly, it's not just lead pipes that cause systemic lead poisoning. In Roman pipes' case, water treatment is super important. Not that Romans treated their water per se, but when they picked out water sources for their aqueducts, and we know this because the manuals survive and it matches the archaeology, so this is pretty firm. They knew that water that's alkaline, that has a lot of chalk in it, that's kind of hard water is going to taste better at the end of the water system. It's going to create a coating on the pipes that's protective. They didn't know necessarily how dangerous lead could be, but they did know lead was kind of toxic. And this meant that of the contributory lead poisoning sources in the ancient world, the plumbing wasn't it, because Romans thought about their water as a system. And not just Romans, engineers in the ancient world were very clever. Just because science is old doesn't mean people from the ancient world are idiots. They have the same brains we do, yeah? They can notice the same stuff we do. We just have the benefit of several thousand years worth of hindsight. Ancient folks figured this out, and you'd think that Flint would have known better, is all I'm saying. It's not just Flint, though. Lead crises are still a major problem in a lot of urban areas, and that's a reckoning we're going to come face to face with soon enough. Say nothing of the rampant environmental lead poisoning in, say, paint chips and gasoline deposits. Well, that's depressing. Let's talk about wells and fountains. Now, the large well you're looking at on the bottom picture of the slide is the Nymphaeum, the fountain house in Corinth. And it's still an active fountain house. If you go back behind the arches, deep inside where you see those back door kind of shaped things, there's still a channel of water running through there. I was there on a day where it was over 100 degrees. The humidity was 90%. I was on the verge of heat stroke because I wilt in the sun. And it was divine. I spent like way too much time back there. Even if I didn't love plumbing before, I loved plumbing that day. This, however, is a luxury fountain house, and it's also meant to be a common fountain used by an entire city. So a regular part of your day, if you lived in an ancient city and weren't wealthy enough to afford somebody else to do this for you, part of your day would be taking a ceramic vessel down to this fountain house, filling it up, and then bringing the water back to your house. And that's how you got most of the water to your house, unless you were very, very fancy. This wasn't necessarily a bug, though, because this was one of the ironclad excuses for women to get out of the house. So going down to the spring and hanging out there to talk to your friends was a major feature of your ancient Greek day. More power to them. When we get into later city plans under Rome and Roman city designs, you get a situation that looks a little bit more like the picture on the top left-hand corner, where you have a very small pipe coming out of a small fountain. This is still a fountain that works. It's an ancient Roman fountain in modern-day France, ancient Gaul, still working, doing what it does. You'll notice this one doesn't have a spigot. Now, Romans did have spigot technology, but it's not used on public fountains. The public fountain is constantly running, and if it's not actively filling up somebody's water vessel, then the runoff continues to flow onto the street, down the gutters. Theoretically, if you have enough water in the system, this can be a cleaning feature. It washes stuff into the storm drains and hopefully out of the city. In practice, what this likely did was make the mucky, poopy nastiness of the streets even muckier and poopier and nastier. This is still an open question. Archaeologists are trying to answer the conundrum of just how much poop was in ancient streets anyway. It's open for debate, so future archaeologists, you too can specialize in poop. I don't know why my tone is like this. Really exciting things are happening in archaeological poop today. You should be a poop scientist. Oh, yes, about that poop. If you are lucky enough to live in a city with particularly well-planned plumbing, and this does seem to be a pretty common thing by the time we get into the 1st century BCE, really 1st and 2nd century CE, then you're going to have access to a public latrine. Now, we are not entirely sure whether these were mixed sex or effectively single sex. I'm not going to weigh in on this too much. I'm just going to lean a little bit towards the idea of mixed sex, just because that does seem to be where the evidence is. This doesn't necessarily mean that bathrooms were safe, but we don't see any binary categorization of bathrooms. They were very much a place where you go to poop. Partly why pooping facilities weren't sexualized in the ancient world is because of the design. One of my colleagues from a former job is demonstrating the appropriate pooping technique in an ancient Roman latrine. You'll notice that there is a little front opening. That is not just if you want to stand up to pee, although standing up to pee doesn't seem to have been a thing Romans really agonized about. Dear goodness, cats, not now. I swear. Pardon me a minute. Okay, crisis averted. You'll notice that notch there in the front of the toilet seat, and then that channel that runs down near where your feet would be. This is where gray water coming out of the fountains would be channeled. In some cities, they'd have dedicated gray water aqueducts that brought non-potable water in for the use of bathing and latrine maintenance. And there would be this item called a tersorium. I think I've got a picture of it on the next slide. More about that in a minute. But that channel there is what you would use to moisten a sponge that was tied to a stick, and then you would use that to wipe your bottom. And then back under the seat, you see that gaping dark space? That's a pit where your poop goes. Now, theoretically, there's water flowing through it to take the sewage to the storm sewer system, but in practice, we find a lot of ancient people's poop still in loco, which means that these things didn't drain very well, and we have great evidence of that in the cultural legacy from these latrines, because these are enclosed spaces. There are walls, there's a ceiling, and then you have open sewage spaces. I want you to cast your mind back to the last time you were at a porta potty, say, or at summer camp in a latrine. So kind of imagine the stench, the pungent aroma of ammonia. Oh, remind me to talk about the pee. More about the pee in a minute. But the real problem is the sewer gases, because as the human feces decompose, they create methane. And this is a culture that does not have electric flashlights or indoor electric lighting. So if you want to go poo after dark, you're going to be coming in with an open flame on an oil lamp. Those of you who are familiar with physics can imagine where this goes. For those of you unfamiliar, it explodes. They thought that this was caused by toilet demons, and we have inscriptions in ancient latrines where people would try to control or avert the toilet demons from coming to get them. But there's a lot of anxiety about being blown up in the toilet, which is probably why these aren't the sexiest places in the ancient world. I mean, the ancient world was pretty full of people who were enjoying themselves on a daily basis, but the latrines don't seem to be a place where a lot of that's happening because, ugh. All right, now about the pee, I should mention this. There would frequently be a pee bucket in the latrine that would be taken by laundry workers and used to create ammonia in order to bleach clothing. So while poop is not that useful in the ancient world, pee is valuable. Eventually, the emperors start taxing it. The first emperor to do this, Vespasian, who was Pliny the Elder's boss, by the way, his advisors kind of looked at him funny when he decided to tax pee coming out of the latrines, and they're like, dude, you're gonna tax pee? And he says, well, look, the revenue doesn't stink, okay? He's got a point. Vespasian did balance the budget. Now, on the right is the alternative to the dangerous demon-filled public latrine, and that is your personal home novelty toilet. So this is a toilet in the shape of a chariot, and the open space underneath is where you would put your bucket. And you would keep this someplace in your house. Often we find latrine facilities near the kitchens in ancient houses. I'm not even going to comment on that. Just take a moment for the horror to sink in while I switch the slide. Ah, yes. So if you were raising your brow at the sponge on a stick method of wiping your butt, you're going to need some context to understand why that's not the worst idea ever. Also, if you can't get toilet paper because somebody bought all of it, then maybe this will be useful to you. Please don't send me pictures. I do not want to know. Now, before the sponge on a stick thing, people would regularly wipe their butts with rocks. Sometimes just rocks that happen to be around, or pottery fragments. Pottery is the disposable plastic of the ancient world. It is just everywhere. And this caused just about as much discomfort as you might think. We have ancient people complaining about hemorrhoids on the regular. There's a whole Hippocratic treatise on hemorrhoids, partially because of the damage wrought by poop rocks. Now, some people liked a more luxurious wipe rock, and will sometimes find rocks like the one on the left. So we call these pessoi, is a fancy word for poop rock. It just means little rocks. And you see the one with a divot on the top? That's a thumb-shaped divot, and then the side is a little bit curved. That's to make it a little bit more ergonomical. Now, this is already kind of horrifying, yes? But we find these in piles next to places where people would go potty. Usually latrine spaces, but also less formal latrines than those fancy Roman marble ones. We also find them in the poop itself, and it seems like the evidence suggests these weren't just one person's rock. Like, you didn't go around with your poop rock that was your own personal poop rock. Rather, you just picked up the rock that was already there, and you hoped that you got one that was decently clean, and you just used your left hand, and then you ate with your right hand and tried to keep that separated. Now, this is a recipe for disaster, and by disaster, I mean the fecal-oral route of disease transmission. For those of you who are not familiar, allow me to horrify you with this very common way of getting sick. This is pretty much what it sounds like. This is when feces go from somebody else into your mouth. You can also do this to yourself. If you've eaten a parasitic organism that's shedding eggs in your poop, you can kind of reinfect yourself. But it's more a problem with other people's poop. Now, it may seem kind of easy to avoid eating other people's poop. Yeah, like, this doesn't seem like it should be a really successful disease transmission mechanism. But that's only if you wash your hands properly, because not all poop is visible. And poop doesn't wash off all that easily sometimes. It's under your nails, it sticks in things, and it doesn't take a lot of poop to transmit disease. Microbes are tiny. That's why they're microbes and not macrobes. Now, to make things a little bit worse, diseases that have a fecal-oral route specifically replicate in a way that poop is extra laden with them. This happens with cholera especially. Cholera doesn't seem to have broken out as much in the Mediterranean, but it's an interesting disease to think with because eventually it reduces your poop to nothing but water waste and cholera. It's just awful. Yeah, if you ever went to tell if someone has cholera, if their poop looks like barley water, they've got cholera probably, or you could test them, or just try to practice really good food hygiene. Like wash your hands, wash your hands. Okay, but it's the ancient world. Now they kind of sort of knew that drinking poop was bad and that touching poop probably also bad. And the sponge on a stick is a leap forward in two directions. First, a sponge on your butt hurts a lot less than a rock. Also, you can dip the sponge in water so it's nice and it's soft and it's moist and you're not damaging tissue, which is important because damaging anal tissue creates perforation in a mucous membrane, which is a great way to get an infection, if not hemorrhoids and complications. So it's nice for cosmetics, like nobody wants a sore butthole, but also it's just good for your health. So go get that good toilet paper if it's still there and you can afford it. The other major leap forward here, though, is the stick part of the sponge on a stick, because your hand is on the end of the stick and your butt is on the sponge. And when the next person comes along, they grab the end of the stick and not the sponge. So although your butt wipey do is now touching somebody else's butt wipey do, your hand, at least if everything goes well, isn't in the same place that the other person's poop is. So as long as everybody keeps the sticks from falling into the poopy water, you do have a slightly higher chance of not getting a fecal oral route transmission of disease. Now, you don't carry around a personal sponge on a stick any more than you do your personal poop rock. Rather, these were stocked in the bathrooms and you just expected one to be there. So these are shared equipment and you'd use them until you ran out. Lovely. Okay, so about the storm sewer systems. This is the final stop-off point for a decent city plumbing system in the ancient world. This is really about as good as it gets. Here we're looking at the Cloaca Maxima, which is the major storm sewer down the Roman Forum. This was originally used to drain the swampy land that was used to build the Forum, and it later served as an outlet for all of the overflow wastewater coming down into the Tiber River Valley from these many aqueducts, now transporting just huge amounts of water into the already swampy land around Rome. In theory, at least, this means that the Romans have created a self-draining system where clean water comes in, the water is reused in a sensible fashion, where it's potable first, then gray water, and then the gray water sweeps down the city, goes into the sewer, and then the sewer flows right into the River Tiber. This is not great civil engineering by modern standards, but by ancient standards, it's pretty good. The degree to which this was an effective way of keeping the streets clean again is still an open question. Interestingly, Rome thought that its sewer system was so important it has its own goddess. And we're looking here at what's left of the shrine of Venus Cloacina. There's a coin showing what this shrine would have looked like back in the day. So Venus is the Roman god of lust and sex. Cloaca is a word that you're probably familiar with if you've taken animal biology, bird biology in particular. Birds, dinosaurs, lizards have a cloaca. A cloaca is an orifice that is a combination reproductive system, bowel, and urinary tract. So you pee through it, you poop through it, and you lay eggs through it. That's a cloaca. Much like the storm sewer of Rome. You pee into it, you poop in it, you lay eggs in it, I guess. Ugh, that's just disgusting. But it's also easy to remember because, of course, Venus is the goddess of the gutter. It just makes perfect sense. Good job, Rome. Here we are inside the Cloaca Maxima. Now, not we, I have never been myself. I really want to go, despite this looking absolutely disgusting. It's still an active storm drain. Now, the picture on the right is an older picture. It's since been dredged and restored a little bit, and you can go in and see it. But this gives you an idea of what the working conditions look like in one of the bigger parts of a Roman water system. Now, in some ways, these workers are lucky. There's a ledge for them to walk on next to the sewer. It's high enough that if you're a child, you're not going to hit your head. But then imagine having to go down and service this with an open flame in an enclosed environment, maybe in the summer when it's really hot. It's just not safe. This also seems to have been a very popular place for dumping bodies. The murder rate in ancient Rome was pretty bad. Behold, the baths of Diocletian. Now, this is a really oversized version of a Roman bath. Most bathhouses aren't this giant. This one was built by the very extra Emperor Diocletian in downtown Rome. But I like to use it because it expands our idea of what we mean when we say bathhouse in the ancient world. It's pretty comprehensive. To start with, as you're walking in, so here we're looking at the front facade. You see where there are all these arches? This is at the bottom of the picture, walking northwards. That is a stoa. So each of those covered porches have little shops inside of them, and it's 2 stories. It's a shopping mall, and you go there to buy anything from like jewelry to cosmetics to, and some of them also had court spaces, so you could go to meet your lawyer, and then you could pick up a bucket of nails, and then you could go see your hairdresser. You get the idea. This was a major hub for business and also a free meeting space. Some people would hang out in the stoi, these front bits, not just of baths, by the way. These occurred outside of baths too, just as standalone strip malls, but this bath is extra. It's a bath with a mall in it. There was a specific school of philosophers who first started hanging out and discussing their ideas about life and reality in the stoi, or the malls, and they took their name from this location, the mall philosophers, or the Stoics. You've probably heard of them and probably didn't think they hung out in malls. Or maybe you did. I don't want to underestimate you. Right. As we move in towards the complex, that big building at the center, that's where the bathing happens. But we're going to come back for that, because on either side, you see those round semicircular kind of ear-shaped things. One of those is a Greek language library, the other is the Latin language library. And that's part of the exercise regime. They thought that reading was exercise. You were expected to do it out loud, and often while walking. And it was something that you would be prescribed as a treatment for all kinds of things, including light exercise when you were recovering from disease. So for instance, me recording this lecture counts as exercise. I can have that extra pint of Talenti key lime. It is delicious. I love gelato. In the back, there are wrestling gyms, the palaestri. We think one might have been a women's and one might have been a men's, but we're not 100% on that. Some baths had men's hours and women's hours. Some baths just didn't. Everybody comes in and bathes. Again, this is not as sexualized a space as it might be to us. This is not to say that it wasn't a semi-sexualized space. It's not as gross as the latrines, and we do know that prostitution took place on a regular basis in the bathhouses. It can't all be happy, fluffy, nice news. Here is the inside of the warm water room, or the tepidarium, the room temperature room at Bath in Bath, England. I'll give you 3 guesses why the town of Bath is called Bath. This is a standard part of any public bath. It's a plunging pool, and this is where you would go to kind of equalize your body temperature, to swim around a little bit. Probably not so much for lap swimming or exercise. This is just more to hang out and dunk in. Now, while you were at the bath, you could engage a number of services, including medical services. A lot of doctors practiced out of the baths. And not just doctors. A lot of gym trainers had a side business in medicine and sports medicine. And this is why you'll notice that Galen complains about them a lot, right? Galen, in Exercise with a Small Ball, hates gymnastic trainers with a vengeance. He is super salty about their harmful bodybuilding techniques and their destructive fad diets and this and that, and their what is it that ruins your mind with stultifying exercises. Galen is very salty there. But part of why he's taking aim at gym trainers, I mean, you might be like, what the hell does he have against personal trainers? Well, they're Galen's competition because they were considered part of the medical profession by a lot of people, especially people who were athletic. And this isn't just people who were professional athletes, but there was a real culture of bodily perfection and beauty standards for men especially, for women too. But the thing that's kind of interesting in the ancient world is that men had a lot of attention paid to what kind of muscles they had, where they were, how big various body parts were, where their hair was, this, that, and the other thing, in a way that women's bodies didn't really get scrutiny for, partly because of what we'll be talking about in a minute. Men were naked a lot more. These are some of many items we've recovered from bathhouse digs, including tweezers. These would be used to pull hair, but they're also medical equipment for splinters, minor surgery, forceps. It's impossible to tell whether this was cosmetic or surgical or what. But that mixing stone is more suggestive of pharmacy, as is the pair of scales. We know that compounding pharmacists sometimes worked out of baths, and often baths were a source for ingredients for pharmacy too. Stay tuned for the disgusting reality behind that one in Pharmacy Week. There's also that leaf-shaped blade that's kind of got that nasty hook to it. That's a lancet. You would use that to bleed somebody, and often people would go to the baths to be bled because if you were in warm water, you would bleed more, you see. But then if you bled too much, you could plunge into cold water and you could control the bleeding a little bit. This meant that bathhouses, yet healthy people were bathing, but they were full of sick people, which is the downside to ancient baths. They are a publicly available, relatively affordable way to clean yourself off with water on a regular basis. Awesome. But they're also full of sick people and combining a bunch of bodily grooming services, inclusive of shaving. And let me pause this for a minute. Aha! It's tomorrow. The baby is napping. We're back to finish this gosh darn lecture. Right. Athletics, as I mentioned earlier, a big part of Regimen, but also a big part of the competition for ancient doctors, as well as the source for trends that our authors are pushing against, especially Galen. So we're looking here at one of, well, two, really, of many, many athletic scenes in ancient art. Athletics culture was huge, both in the Greek-speaking end of the Mediterranean and in ancient Rome as well. Both cultures and other cultures seem to have done this too. It's a pan-Mediterranean phenomenon. Invested heavily in infrastructure for wealthier people to have access to gym facilities, and exercising was done in groups, in game and play, as well as competition, and there's a lot of slippage between competition and games, in the same way there is today. But the practicalities of what you have to do with your body in order to participate in athletics in the ancient world is different enough that we need to talk about it. And the first big thing that you'll notice is that these folks are exercising in the nude. Now, this was typical for men. Women would tend to wear abbreviated underpants and bra combos. This was for practical reasons. There's no spandex in the ancient world. When you get sweaty, your clothing has to be laundered. This increases expenses. So it is more economically viable to exercise naked. But what this means is that the culture of ideal bodies and body types became incredibly competitive and also unforgiving, because your naked body was going into a social space competing with your peers, who would then judge you based on the way your body looked. And by judge you, I don't just mean in terms of beauty standards, but ancient cultures conflated physical beauty with moral beauty. Now, some ancient people did push back against this, but by and large, people would look at you and then make conclusions about your moral worthiness based on how fit you were. And this got very granular too. There was such a thing as too fit or the wrong kind of athletic body. This works on social scales too. There were bodies that were fetishized in enslaved people that were different from the kind of bodies that elites and free people strove to achieve. This has direct repercussions for the history of plastic surgery, so stay tuned for that. But now we need to talk about fad diets and harmful exercising practice. Most of the people who had eating disorders and exercise disorders in the ancient world were men, or male-coded people, trans men too, so far as we have evidence for the trans experience in the ancient world, did seem to get the short end of the body shaming stick from all kinds of directions. But even for folks who were male-bodied, male-identifying people, this toxic culture of body shaming and body judging led people to extreme diets, extra exercise. One of the ways that you showed that you were a freeborn person with access to a free person's advantages. Hi, kitty. Hi, kitty. This is Scipio. He'd like to say hi to you. He's 21. Isn't he adorable? Say hi, students. Hello. You're going to meet my entire family by the time this is over. At any rate, what were we talking about? Fad diets, harmful practices. Yeah, so this seems to have led a lot of ancient people to do some really extreme and destructive stuff that was ultimately detrimental to their health. And physicians capitalized on this social dynamic. That's your butt. Take your butt out of the camera. We see this dynamic really clearly in Galen, especially in Exercise with a Small Ball. It's one of the reasons why I had you read it. Now, Galen isn't just telling you about avoiding gym trainers and gym trainer advice for your own good, although that is part of it. I'm not giving Galen enough credit. He's pushing back on some really toxic dynamics, but also he's doing this in order to get people to stop going to their gymnastic trainer. Gymnastics, by the way, doesn't just mean gymnastics in the ancient world. The word for an exercise place was the gymnasion, which is where we get gymnasium from in English. It's a compound of two Greek words. Gymnos means naked, and nasion is the place of. So gymnasium in the ancient world meant very literally the place of the naked people, which gives you some idea. You can see some of the impact of this body culture in the art. You'll notice that for Mediterranean dudes, there's not a lot of body hair, yes. They have lovely, lovely beards that our vase painter has highlighted in that nice ochre red color, but their bodies are smooth. This is part of what you'd get when you went to the baths in the gymnasion, is that you'd get your body hair waxed. This was both an aesthetic thing, but also a practical thing. Some of this came from an idea that the ideal male body was the body of someone who is just beginning to go through puberty. This means minimal pubic hair, minimal body hair, and even for grown men, the beard was their marking point between somebody who's fully grown and somebody who's young and has the ideal desirable body. There was still this culture of making your body look younger by removing all of the hair. Um, as mentioned earlier, this can be detrimental to your health. Also, it hurts. A lot of these areas that you're removing hair from are super delicate. Um, Baths would have been filled with the screams of people getting their hair pulled. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about ancient theories of reproduction and sexuality, but some of this removal of body hair also had to do with the way people thought that sex worked. The short version is they thought that excess pubic and body hair comes from excess sexual activity. So people would look at your hairiness and judge you for your sexual behavior. So when I say toxic, this is a really toxic and difficult to live in culture, and also one in which your naked body, if you were a man, would be on display, not just to your buddies and your friends, but because bathhouses became a place of meeting, of social networking, of power brokering, this meant that when you met with your boss, often you'd be naked and your boss would be judging your naked body. So the pressure on men to conform to these beauty standards was substantial and crushing in a way that I think only people in the modeling industry can replicate today in any way. Maybe also dancers, performers, Hollywood actors. I say that as if this doesn't touch us, though. I mean, I think about what my body looks like. I don't think there's any one of us who's ever obsessed about and felt judged for what they look like, how they present to the world. And fat shaming is still a thing that we do that has real repercussions when it comes to access to healthcare, to bias in physician-patient relationships. This is something that we've already seen in the ancient texts. Yeah, body judging and shaming isn't something that just modern doctors do. So if you're planning to go into medicine, now is a good time to start to unpack this and to unlearn these biases. They're very old. They're very difficult to deprogram. They're hard to get around. We're trained since we're small to look at people and make judgments about them. It's how humans form relationships. It's how we access the world. And it's very difficult to undo. So don't be sorry, don't feel shame. Just it takes some time to unpack it and work on yourself so you don't replicate this stuff. Please don't be like Galen and try to use it to sell your new healthcare workout regime. I mentioned earlier that athletics cultures, although they are pretty normative for men, aren't restricted to men. We have women in athletics in the ancient world too. These don't seem to have been on quite the same scale. There aren't public open athletic competitions like the Olympics were, but women did participate in competitive athletics and workout culture. This is from a bathhouse mosaic in Roman Britain. I think this comes from London. You can see that this is a mosaic that's been put on an older mosaic where the concrete is chipped. You can see down to the sublayer. And this shows women engaging in athletics competitively. We know it's competitive if you look at the bottom register of the mosaic, where there's a woman holding a palm branch, putting a crown on her own head. She's the winner. She just won. Yay, go her. The other reason I wanted you to see this bit of artwork, though, is that there's a game of small ball in progress. This exercise with a small ball thing that Galen is so enamored with, it's an actual thing. There are historians who try to reconstruct the rules of it. It seems to have been a combination of catch and hacky sack, and this is one of the sources that we use to unpack what's going on in small ball games. You can see that these two competitors are exercising their upper bodies, there's throwing in progress, and they're wearing these very abbreviated bikini-ish outfits. We have a Roman bikini bottom actually surviving. These were made out of either linen or not rawhide, tanned leather. Leather is preferred because in the swampy environment of bathhouses, leather swells and clings to the body. Linen expands and tends to sag over time. Not as bad as wool, but it's not a great athletic fiber. Before spandex, you don't have a great number of options. This is all also before the invention of knitted fabrics. So stretchy fabrics could only be achieved by cutting cloth on the bias, which creates a lot of fabric waste. Let's see. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say, yeah, so we do have one leather bikini bottom surviving from the Thames River in London. The survival conditions at the bottom of the Thames are such that leather items tend to last a lot better than they do in other places. And the style of the bikini we have is a string bikini. It ties on either hip. Goodness gracious. Sorry, my kitty wants pets and love now, and mommy has to work. Work from home, they said. It'll be fun, they said. Yes, this is another athletic scene. Back to our male wrestlers. They're with their gymnastic coach or their wrestling coach. This is the kind of person that you would go to if you were going to the gym for your primary health care. And a lot of gymnastic coaches do seem to be primary care providers in the same way that sports medicine specialists or trainers tend to be a first-stop shop for medical information and advice. Gym trainers, personal trainers have to have medical information because they are giving medically relevant advice that, if irresponsibly given, can cause real harm and damage. And here you see our two competitors training with each other. Now, you may be wondering, watching this wrestling, and wrestling does seem to be one of the major ways that men would get their workouts, women too, of course, but this seems to be more of a man thing. How they're preparing their bodies to do this thing. Or maybe you weren't asking, but you're going to find out anyway. You didn't just take off your clothes and start wrestling. You needed to prepare the surface of your body by rubbing it with olive oil. And this was done for practical athletic purposes, but also as part of the bath process. There wasn't soap in use in ancient Rome per se. Soap was available as a luxury trade good, but it wasn't the preferred method for cleaning the body, which may be a bit horrifying to us in the age of hand washing. But for Romans, soap wasn't an effective way of cleaning to them. They felt that it was too harsh, that it strips the skin, and that it causes irritation. They're not necessarily wrong. Oil is a way that you can cleanse your body. I can't really speak to the effectiveness of it as a way of removing microbes from your body, but there is a school of skin cleansing that uses oil that's becoming more popular. In fact, if you're into skincare regimens, you're probably familiar. And it's a pretty good idea. It's an effective way to cleanse your face if you're prone to irritation and acne outbreaks. So, the way this worked in the ancient world is that you would rub your skin with olive oil, often olive oil that had other herbs infused into it, thyme, basil, aromatic perfumes, but often just plain olive oil would do. Once you'd rubbed it into your skin, you would then put gritty dust over your body in order to give yourself some traction. So it's a little bit like oil wrestling. This is still something that people do in Turkey. They just wear leather pants to do it. In the ancient world, you'd put it onto your naked skin. The dirt had two functions. First, it would make it easier for your opponent to grab you when you were wrestling. But then once you were done with your workout, your body would sweat underneath the layer of oil. The oil would act to encourage grit to come out of your pores. Then the grit that you'd put onto your body would create an exfoliating sensation that you would then scrape off your body, and there'll be pictures in a minute. Now, even if you didn't work out, you would still cover your body in olive oil before you went into the hot part of the baths. You would use heat to cause yourself to sweat, and this combination of sweat and oil would cause the upper layer of your skin to slough off. At this point, you would engage in the next activity we're going to look at. Next slide. Oh, sorry, we're not there yet. I thought the next thing I was going to talk about was skin scrapers. Apparently it is not. But I'm going to talk about it now in case I'm misremembering what slide is in here. If you flip back to the slide with the sponge on a stick, there was this bronze kind of hook-shaped thing. That's called a strigil, and that's the thing that you would use to remove the layer of grit and oil and sweat from your body after you had gone to the baths. You would then take those scrapings and slurp them off of your strigil and then leave them on the ground. These scrapings would be used in pharmaceutical preparations. If you're horrified, stay tuned. We're going to find out what's up with that when we talk about pharmacy. So it's a teaser to the horrors to come. Now, this is not necessarily a bad way to cleanse your body. The pressure of the scraper as it's in contact with your skin forces the oil that's now sitting in your pores with the sweat to express itself. This removes the top layer of skin. This uncovers pimple tissues. It makes you nice and squeaky and exfoliated, but also moisturized because there's still some oil on your body. And this is an effective way of removing grime from the skin. There's certain schools of thought that say that by using oils instead of soaps to clean, you're not disturbing your skin's natural microbiome as much. There are good bacteria that live on your skin, and also bacteria that can be harmful if they get inside of your body. Streptococcus is one of these. Streptococcus naturally lives on your skin. It's not a bad thing, unless it infects part of your body that it's not supposed to be in. That aside, though, there are other harmless bacteria that, if they colonize your skin, can crowd out less nice bacteria. There's a school of thought that says that by encouraging a healthy microbiome on your skin surface, you're creating a protection against infection when you're scratched, but also controlling the nastier things that can happen with your body. Odor is one of these, but also skin infections. Some people claim that by exfoliating with oil, you can control your underarm odor so much that you don't need deodorant. I myself have not tested it, and I do not intend to do so. You can kind of disprove this from internal medicine in the ancient, or internal evidence from the ancient world, because there are preparations for underarm deodorant that were used, and Romans would be very judgmental about you if you smelled of BO. This is something we tend to assume about the ancient world, is that everybody goes around wafting BO and people are okay with it. And while there is probably a little bit more general tolerance towards BO in the ancient world than we have today, there's not a lot of it. And there is a lot of poetry from the ancient world where one person is telling another person to go buy some deodorant already because they stink. The idiom for underarm odor in the ancient world is the underarm goat, or the armpit goat. And the way that you would semi-politely tell somebody that their armpit stinks in the ancient world is you'd be like, hey, you've got a goat in your pit. Do you want to go and slay that armpit goat? To find out how, wait for the pharmacy lecture. Now, I'd been mentioning fad diets that were harmful. One of these that was really trendy in Galen's day was the gladiator diet. This was a carb-heavy vegetarian diet that deliberately packed on chubby flesh over muscle. And this was both a diet trend and a bodybuilding technique that was used by enslaved people who were forced to fight for entertainment, that is, gladiators. Not necessarily used by them, but inflicted upon them, I think is a better way of stating this, as a safety measure. Because if you have a good fat layer over your muscle, when you're cut in the arena, you'll bleed, but you won't necessarily threaten the important muscle structures under that fatty layer. You also insulate your body from sepsis and infected wounds a little bit. Now, Galen, because his first job out of ancient med school, wasn't really med school, but it's kind of med school, was taking care of gladiators. He was actively engaged in the sports medicine world, and I think this informs the kind of arguments he's making in Exercise with a Small Ball. Now, for Romans who weren't forced to work as gladiators, this became a trendy body goal because gladiators were superstars. I mean, yes, they were enslaved. Yes, they were being trafficked and exploited, but they were also huge sources of revenue, very popular. People immortalized them on their walls. To get a sense of how this dynamic worked, and forgive me if this comes across as critical of professional sports, it is kind of Mr. Spouse is a fan and he gets a little irritated when I go on about this, but it's a real issue that is worth talking about. So professional sports relies on athletes who get into the sport due to a combination of systemic problems in access to education for poor people, especially poor people of color. This means that when we get into professional sports, folks are sorry guys, my cat has figured out how to operate the touch screen and she turned off the recording from the last slide. So the good news is that I've got pictures of strigils here. Here they are. Awesome. The word rupos is the ancient word for the scrapings of dirt and sweat and oil that you take off of your body at the end of a good workout or session in the baths. And we find sets of these strigils with convenient portable olive oil containers, which is what you're looking at the top of the slide. But I was talking about professional athletes. Now, part of why people go into professional athletes is that we incentivize it as a way to afford college educations, which are increasingly out of reach for people of modest means and income, and especially folks with student loans. And for some people, this is an effective way to get an education. In fact, I know some of you are doing this right now, and more power to you because this involves a lot of extra labor on your part. But it's a complicated way of putting together an economical structure, isn't it? Because if you're severely injured and unable to continue with athletics, this impacts your ability to continue to pay for college. Likewise, your athletic obligations can sometimes, not always, but sometimes make it difficult to have the time you need to devote to studies. In a well-run athletics program, they protect you and let you do what you need to do to earn your credits and get to your degree, but not every school does this well. And I've had students for whom this has been a real problem, as well as students for whom athletic programs have provided a context that keeps them on track, where their coach is an active partner in their career. This has a lot to do with how ethical your coach is. Ethical coaches are the bomb. I love them. They're fantastic. Back to gladiatorial competitions, though. I'm not saying that modern pro sports, especially pro football, is as exploitative as a system in which human beings are deliberately trafficked for public entertainment, but it is a system that doesn't tend to result in ideal outcomes, even for the most professional athletes. The injury rate is high, the retirement age is low, your ability to continue to earn income is predicated on how well your injury outcomes are, and often you can be left with not a good nest egg for your future in a body that's deeply broken. Maybe pro football isn't the best place to poke at this, because I think one can find even bigger problems in the world of professional wrestling. WWE in particular has severe labor and compensation problems with its wrestlers, and chronic pain issues and early death are endemic to the world of pro wrestling. So if you want to take this up as a cause for ethical sports and entertainment sports in particular, then advocating for the rights of professional wrestlers is a wonderful use of your time and talents. Not to tell you what to do with your lives or anything, but part of why a lot of people find gladiators a fun thing from the ancient world, I don't. I find them really sad because what we're looking at is this systemic exploitation of the bodies of people who don't have a lot of say in what's done with their bodies. And I think bodily autonomy is a basic human right. And I find it really distressing when people are in situations where they aren't the primary decision makers about how their body is treated, how their injuries are healed, whether or not they continue to work with a body that's hurt and hurting. And this is a larger problem. It's not just an athletic problem. We are not kind to injured and ill people in our society. And that's something that weighs on me when I think about just how much has and has not changed from ancient medicine to modern medicine. Let's see, if I said everything I wanted to say about scraping glurk off your skin. Yes, I think so. Let us move then. We're almost at the home stretch, guys. Thank you for holding in with me. Let's talk a little bit about clothing. Now, this may not seem to be part of regimen, but it is. We've already talked a little bit how clothing shapes the kind of ways in which athletic participation happens. That is, how naked you are when you're doing athletics in the ancient world. But it's also a part of why regimen looks the way it does, both in Regimen for Health and in Galen's exercise with a small ball. Because when you're not naked in a gym, the kind of clothing you're wearing is very loose, both loosely secured and not necessarily exercise compatible always. On the top slide, we're looking at elite garments on the left and non-elite garments on the right. In the middle, you've got a dude in very expensive military gear. The military is wearing short tunics for mobility, but this also means that your legs are largely nude. When you're serving on the northern frontier, this meant that you were often cold. One of the most common letters we get from the northern front in ancient Roman military records is, "Oh my God, so cold, please send socks." Now, for our elite folks on the left, this means that you're wearing stuff that isn't very practical for, say, taking long walks, exercising with small balls. For women especially, because the norms are so strict about keeping yourself covered whenever you're outside of a bath environment, this means that your exercise accessibility is kind of limited. And for upper class women in particular, you're not going to have great freedom of movement. The bottom panel shows the emperor's family. This is from the Arapacus, for those of you who've taken Roman art. This is stuff that looks very impressive, but isn't great workout gear. What it does have going for it is that it's loose. There isn't a lot of constricting corsetry or body shaping gear. This means that there's good air circulation, that you do have some kinds of freedom of movement that you don't have in other clothing cultures. For instance, once people start wearing corsets, bending over and the ability to breathe freely is restricted. Side note, corsetry is not just for women in the history of fashion. Men wore corsets in a lot of periods too, with just as much bodily harm. On the right, you see what most people's clothing looked like. Both men and women with a bit of an asterisk. Women's clothing was like the tunics you're looking at on these men, but much, much longer. Working women would wear tunics that were at least as long as their knees, maybe their calves. Enslaved women would wear shorter tunics, both as a way to enable them to do heavy work, but also because the person who owned them would not necessarily be paying for good clothing. This shouldn't be a shock, but it's something we don't think about a lot. One of the things that would have been very difficult about being enslaved in any period, we find this for every slave-owning culture, is that you don't choose your clothing. your clothing is bought and provided by the person who has bought you, and that person is not very incentivized to give you nice stuff. This means that a lot of folks who are enslaved are wearing rough, uncomfortable cloth that's made to wear well, but you don't have a lot of it. Cato the Elder recommends, for instance, that his enslaved farm laborers only need one new tunic a year. Think about if you only had one t-shirt, and that's the only thing you could wear while you harvested fields by hands. And then you get a sense of how problematic clothing culture is in the ancient world. This is some of what informs the kinds of exercises Galen considers accessible. What's the other thing I wanted to say about this? Oh yes, this also informs how comfort is going to work. For the moderate climate of the ancient Mediterranean, this is a pretty comfortable way to dress. If it's very, very hot, you're going to be a little uncomfortable if you're an upper class person. We find linen was the fabric of choice in these hot areas. So North Africa, for instance, wears a lot more linen than does Southern Europe, which is a very wool-heavy culture. And then as you get further and further north, wool is more the standard. However, with the opening of trade routes first to India in the Hellenistic period, and after that the Silk Roads to China during the Roman imperial period, silk became more and more accessible, and it's something you'll see Galen mentioning, both as a cloth being worn by people and also a material that's used in sutures. But we're going to save that for the surgery lecture. Okay, one more thing to talk about, and then we're good, folks. And that is gardens, fountains, and landscapes of health. Now, I talked a lot about the dirty, gritty, nasty bits of ancient cities. Mr. Spouse is home. There are investments in gardens, both private gardens and publicly available gardens, that if you have the time, you could have access to. And this is a big part of the regimen advice that you see in both Galen and the Hippocratic authors. There's an assumption that you're going to be doing a lot of slow walking and strolling in green environments. Something that the ancient world has over on us is that they don't have a labor force that is mechanized and timed by modern timepieces. This means that for a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people, you had fewer demands on your time hour by hour by hour, which meant you had a little bit more flexibility for leisure time, for social time. That's one of the things that is a little bit more healthy about the ancient Mediterranean, is that they had time and space to invest in social networking, and not only did they think that that was important, but it's something that's prioritized, at least for folks who aren't being exploited for their labor. And I'll leave you with this pleasant image of a garden in Pompeii. Now, this is from a reconstruction of a fancy person's villa, so this isn't everybody's backyard, but even apartment complexes centered around a courtyard space that would have been a shared community area. And that's where a lot of your living would have taken place in the ancient world. Now, this isn't a great thing when we talk about spread of disease in the ancient world, but it is a nice thing when we're thinking about social life and landscapes, which is nice. Yeah, so take care, be well, stay classy, take care of yourselves, your families, your neighbors, your people. Stay inside. Let me know how you're doing. If stuff goes sideways, please reach out. Hang in there, and good luck, guys. I miss you guys so very much. Not seeing you twice a week has been kind of hard. Yeah, miss you. Take care. Bye-bye.